For the Cardinals to have a contending rotation, how many starters should be better than Miles Mikolas in 2024? Plus, do the Cardinals have the best hitter in all of Double-A? Coming up on B-Schaeff Daily. What's going on, everybody, and welcome in to this edition of B-Schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer back with you in the evening hours of Friday, August 25th, 2023. Cardinals take the loss tonight in Philadelphia. That's nothing new. Miles Mikolas on the hill. It's been a tough stretch of late for Miles, and that continued tonight as he gave up 5 runs over 6 innings of work for the Cardinals as the Phillies take the game 7-2, dropping the Cardinals back down to 17 games below 500 as Mikolas drops to an 0-4 record for the month of August. Just has not been his month. 12 earned runs allowed over his past 2 outings, 16 earnings over his past 3 starts for the Cardinals. It's been rough, and it begs the question, where should Miles Mikolas slot into the 2024 rotation to give you, the Cardinals fan, confidence that this rotation will be a contending one? Because we spent a lot of time talking about, okay, the Cardinals need 3 starting pitchers. They seem to know that, as John Mozeliak has indicated, they will get 3 starting pitchers from outside the organization to form the starting 5 next year. But when we've been having those conversations, it's generally been with the idea that Miles Mikolas would be toward the front of the line, that the Cardinals would need to go out and get an ace probably, but that Miles Mikolas could slot as high as the number 2 in that rotation. But if you look at Mikolas' numbers this season, it's been his worst year as a Cardinal. He's had some good years as a St. Louis Cardinal, no doubt, but his numbers at this point, I mean, there's a case to be made that those numbers are declining. Miles Mikolas just turned 35 years old this week, has a 2-year extension that he signed back in February. Where does Miles Mikolas slot into the rotation next year? Or rather, where should he slot in, Cardinals fans, to give you confidence that this rotation is indeed going to be reworked in such a way that will allow the Cardinals to go from a team that can sit here 17 games below 500 in late August to a contender once again in 2024. It's August 25th right now, the famous date back in 2011 where the Cardinals were 10.5 games out. And, of course, rallied to make a wild card, win the World Series, all that good stuff. Yeah, that's not happening this year. I know the Cardinals are only like 11.5 out of a wild card spot right now. I'm not even going to take the time to pull up the standings because it just doesn't matter. This Cardinals team is going nowhere fast. It's evident almost on a nightly basis watching this team. And again, we kind of figured that it would be that way after they decided to trade a good portion of the quality pitchers on the staff at the deadline to try and recoup younger players to perhaps restock that farm system for the future with an eye on 2024. Which also brings us to the second topic we're going to talk about tonight. If you're listening to B-Schaeff Daily on Spotify or Apple Podcast, you don't have to go anywhere. You'll get to hear about both topics right in the same spot. If you're listening on YouTube, which I'd love for you to do, even if you're not, head on over youtube.com/@bschaeffer12 and click subscribe on the channel. I'm going to split it up into 2 different videos because we've got 2 distinct topics to talk about tonight. Miles Mikolas, the question posed will be the first one. Go ahead and drop it in the comments with your thoughts on where Miles needs to land, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in that Cardinals rotation for 2024. And whatever your answer is essentially the challenge to John Mozeliak to get X number of better pitchers than Miles Mikolas. I guess it would be N-1 because Mikolas is obviously going to be in one of those spots. So if he's the 5th starter, which would be aggressive, but if he's the 5th starter, 5-1, that means you think John Mozeliak would need to go out and get 4 better starting pitchers. But what's that number for you? Try to be reasonable about it, but I think it's a fair question. With Miles Mikolas sitting now, ERA above 4.5 at 4.66 for the season, that would be the highest that he's had as a Cardinal. But the other topic I want to get into relates back to that trade deadline where the Cardinals said, hey, all this pitching, it's got to go. All these short-term contracts, they got to go. We got to get people that we're going to have under control, restock for 2024 and beyond. One of those deals the Cardinals made might have netted the team the best hitter in all of Double-A baseball at this point in time. The Cardinals have a youngster in Double-A that is absolutely in fuego, and he was up to his old tricks again on Friday night. We'll talk about who that player is, and what we see as the future for him with the Cardinals. That's going to be in another video here on YouTube. It'll be the second half of this podcast if you're listening to B-Schaeff Daily on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. 2 different videos on YouTube. But let's go ahead and get into the first topic here, which is Miles Mikolas. What's that number got to be in your mind, Cardinals fans? Because I would have said, coming into the season, when you knew Adam Wainwright was going to be retiring, you knew that Montgomery and Flaherty were free agents to be, Miles Mikolas looked like the last man standing, the best remaining man standing, with Steven Matz also penciled into a spot in the rotation, assuming 2023 went well for him. And he had his own sort of roller coaster up and down, more like a down and up, and then back down with the injury this season. But you figure he's going to be part of that mix as well for next year. But Miles Mikolas, you would have said, he's a really solid number 2 if you're getting the most out of him that you expect to be able to do. Miles Mikolas, when he came to the Cardinals in 2018, was fantastic. 2.83 ERA through 200 innings. Not a huge strikeout guy. And that kind of points to a lot of the issues, I guess, the Cardinals are having this year, where they're looking for a lot more swing and miss. And it's not that Miles Mikolas is the wrong type of pitcher. Last year, he was an all-star as well, just like in 2018. Had some injured years between there, with 2020 being completely washed out, and 2021 a partial season for Miles Mikolas with the injuries. But 2022, man, last year he was great. 3.29 ERA, another 200-inning season for Miles, 153 strikeouts. So in both of his quality years, strikeout not really a huge part of his game. Ks per 9 in 2018 were 6.5, and in 2022, his other All-Star campaign, 6.8. That's kind of the pitcher that Miles Mikolas has been over his career in the big leagues, even dating back before the Cardinals got him. Remember, he went a couple of years with the Padres and the Rangers, then went overseas, came back when the Cardinals signed him out of Japan. But he's a 6.6 career strikeout per 9 guy in Major League Baseball. And when you don't strike out a lot of guys, you do leave yourself susceptible to some bad luck. And I guess you could say that Miles Mikolas has had that this year, because when you look at his FIP, fielding independent pitching, 3.99 this season, despite, well, I guess it may not be 3.99 anymore. I'm looking at Baseball Reference, which has not updated his stats following tonight's game, but let's assume it's right around 4.0, but the ERA is 4.66, so he has been unlucky, unless his FIP jumped almost a full run tonight. I'm going to assume it didn't go up all that much. His ERA went up by 0.11. His FIP is probably around 4.0, 4.1. The ERA, a solid half run higher, but last year, it's just so interesting how, and again, I've not always been heavy into FIP. I said, I'm not one of them FIPsters. But that was largely back when, first of all, no pitch clock, no shift ban, and the Cardinals had gold glovers at every position on their infield defense, essentially. So when I used to think about guys like Dakota Hudson, I made the claim that, I know his FIP is much higher than his ERA most years, pretty much every year until 2022, but I also figured that could be sustainable for Dakota Hudson for as long as he's a St. Louis Cardinal. But we've seen the Cardinals' edge defensively decline, in part due to maybe inconsistency from the players that were previously great, which I don't put a lot of stock into that. I think Goldschmidt's still a good first baseman defensively. Arenado is still a great third baseman defensively, the first half of the year notwithstanding. He's more than made up for it since then. He's locked back in since right around the All-Star break, I would say. But up the middle, you've had kind of a revolving door at shortstop. Hopefully Mason Wynn is the guy that can settle that position down for the Cardinals. But you had DeYoung. Well, first you had Edman, and then it was DeYoung, and then kind of a mix of both, and now Mason Wynn. And second base, you haven't had consistency there either. Donovan's a Gold Glover there. Edman was once a Gold Glover there. Donovan, of course, winning the Gold Glove for the utility role. Edman, former Gold Glover at second. When he got time there, you figured that would be fine. But then you see a lot more Nolan Gorman this year as well. And as much as we like Nolan Gorman, he's the lesser of the three, the least of the three in terms of defensive prowess at second base. So this infield defense that once was for the Cardinals, not as consistent as it used to be, which is why a guy like Dakota Hudson, you see those struggles happen last year, in part due to it's just the FIP catching up to him. But now this year it has been, I think, exemplified even further with a guy like Miles Mikolas, where you add in the changing of the guard defensively, where it's just not the same consistent group that it was. But I think even more of an impact has been the ban on the shift, because the Cardinals had maybe the biggest edge in Major League Baseball. And I'm saying that anecdotally. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it sure seems that way when you think back to how the Cardinals, and Ollie Marmol has talked about this as well, they did a really good job of being able to position their defenders effectively and get the most out of the defensive positioning that they utilized. And it's not that they can't still make strides toward doing that, but you're hampered. You're limited by the nature and the scope of that rule, which I think affects a guy like Miles Mikolas as much as it perhaps impacts any pitcher in Major League Baseball. So it's so interesting that his FIP this year, around 4.0. Last year it was 3.87 with a 3.29 ERA. So about a half a run better in the ERA last year than the FIP. And this year it's been the exact opposite. About a half a run worse in ERA than his FIP, which is essentially the way it's honestly supposed to work out. It kind of just normalizes over the course of time. You expect over the long haul your FIP and your ERA generally to kind of align with one another, because the more you pitch, the more luck is going to even out for you. And it's interesting to see that with Miles Mikolas, 3.85 career ERA, 3.97 career FIP. That's about in line with what you might reasonably expect. But Miles Mikolas does seem to be more susceptible to struggles not only the rest of this season, but moving forward into 2024 because of where he is on the age curve. He just turned 35 years old, and while he doesn't rely on overpowering stuff, striking guys out, he's a pitch-to-contact pitcher, and that generally you'd think could be something that works okay as you age. But is it going to be enough for Miles Mikolas to still be considered the number 2 in the Cardinals rotation? What about the number 3 in a contending rotation for 2024? Or is even that too lofty of a goal? Because John Mozeliak certainly has his work cut out for him, as we know, with this offseason needing to restock a rotation that is basically bereft of the type of talent that they believe should stock a contending rotation. Cardinals fans seem to feel that way as well. Guys like Zach Thompson, he's gonna have a shot to contribute in some way or another in 2024. Maybe it's as the 6th starter. Maybe it's as the number 5 starter, because John Mozeliak says, hey, we're going to get 3 guys, but maybe they don't. Maybe it doesn't go the way that he hopes, which I would consider to be a pretty big risk. It's why it makes it a little bit curious the way the Cardinals, and they've done this in the past, this is not a new trend for them, but announce exactly what they intend to do and what they need going into an offseason so that everybody is aware of it and can essentially hold you accountable to that. In a year like last offseason, it works really well because they got Wilson Contreras, they spent up for him, and they can puff their chest out and say, look, we spent $87.5 million. See, we told you catcher was our biggest need, and we went out and filled it. Other off seasons, thinking back over the past decade or so, there have been multiple times where the onus has been on the team to get an outfielder, and they announce it, and they say, we need a new center fielder, or we need a corner outfield bat with power. You can think back to the various off seasons of Marcell Ozuna, Dexter Fowler, like the additions that were made typically came after John Mozeliak got in front of a camera and a microphone and said, we need this position, and that's our goal to fill it in the offseason, which is great candor. It's wonderful transparency. The fan base, I think, appreciates it because they then kind of know what to expect. But it also seems like the Cardinals have made their best moves and have had their best off seasons when they haven't been so forthright in explaining exactly what they're planning to do. Like, a lot of Cardinals fans were on pins and needles hoping that a move for a guy like Paul Goldschmidt could happen when they acquired him in, what was that, the offseason between 2018 and 2019, I believe it was. Make that trade happen under the cover of darkness. Bam. That's exciting stuff. Nolan Arenado deal. What was so exciting about it is the Cardinals didn't come out and say, yes, we're looking for a third baseman and it's going to happen. You give away a certain amount of leverage, I think, when you announce that to the public. So in those trades, the Cardinals were able to operate under their circumstances and make sure they got a deal that worked for them. But free agency, man, it seems like it's always going the other direction because they're out there saying this is what we need to do, which, again, you can't really hide from it when you look at the rotation right now filled with retiring Adam Wainwright, Zach Thompson, Dakota Hudson, who have, various levels of belief behind them. Matthew Liberatore before the injury. Now Drew Rom is in that group. Steven Matz before the injury. And Mikolas just hanging out there is the one guy that you go, okay, they have signed him to be a starter for next year, so he's going to be in that group. It's pretty evident looking at the group right now that there are some holes that need to be filled, but it's interesting to go on record and say 3 is the number that that we see as a need, and 3 is the number that we're going to get. Where that puts John Mozeliak in terms of his ability to follow through on those expectations remains to be seen. But as it pertains to Miles Mikolas, I think it's really interesting because they could get 3 starters and have Miles Mikolas be the number 1, right? They could sign somebody to a multi-year deal, but not one of the big guns that you're hoping they'll get. Not a franchise record-setting free agent contract, the type that I honestly think they'll need to sign somebody to. If you're going after Aaron Nola, he's breaking the Wilson Contreras record of $87.5 million to a free agent who had not previously played for the organization. That's what we're talking about when it's talking about trying to get an ace for next year. But maybe they don't do that. And then maybe they trade for somebody, but it's not the big trade that you're looking for, but technically it's a guy with some major league starting experience, and they plug him into the rotation, and maybe they sign somebody else off of a, like a 1-year deal, like a prove-it deal or something like that. And suddenly you're going, all right, technically they followed through. They got 3 guys like they said they would, but fans would be in an uproar because they could say, those 3 guys are equivalent to Hudson, Thompson, Liberatore. What did you even bother for? You had that internally. That's why I think it's so important for the Cardinals not only to get 3 guys, but to get guys that are better than what they already have. You expect a guy like Hudson to basically be what he's been, which, by the way, not that terrible over the course of his big league career, like a 3.6 ERA. We'll see him on Saturday, I believe. But the Cardinals, again, kind of like with Miles Mikolas, you look at it and say, defensive advantage for a pitch-to-contact pitcher, not what it once was. And Hudson doesn't have even really the stuff historically that Miles Mikolas has shown. So you worry about plugging a guy like Hudson back into your rotation for 2024 unless, what's the caveat that I've given? It's 2 things. Strikeout rate's got to go up, and more consistently than every couple of weeks you have a 7 strikeout performance, but in between it's 2 Ks, 3 Ks, and you're walking basically as many guys as you can in those games. And then the other part is the walks. You have got to lower the walk rate. And if Dakota Hudson can do those 2 things, I'll be first in line to give him a shot or to advocate in the offseason that he deserves a shot. But I think you've got to see that consistently, and you're sort of running out of stretch in the calendar to be able to do that with vigor and to know that it's something worth standing behind and believing in. It's got to be consistent off the sheet the rest of the year, or you just say, kind of fluky. Yeah, the ERA looks pretty nice, but we've seen that before. Who's to say he's not going to backslide into the 2022 version of Hudson if the FIP and the BABIP luck doesn't go in his way? Fair questions, and it's why I think the Cardinals are lukewarm at best on the idea of mentally diving back in on strongly considering Hudson for a role in the rotation next year. He seems like a potential trade candidate to me, and I do believe he deserves to be in a starting rotation in Major League Baseball. To me, he is one of the 150 best Major League ready starters on the planet. Call me crazy, but I think Dakota Hudson, a lot of Cardinals fans sell him short because for reasons that I don't think are wrong or unfair, they've got Dakota Hudson fatigue in many ways. But it doesn't mean he's a terrible player or a terrible pitcher. But I think if you're the Cardinals, having just endured this type of season in very loudly proclaiming that you have to approach pitching differently in 2024, I don't think it's a fit for Dakota Hudson if we just see more of the same, even if that leads to a good ERA the rest of the way. I don't think that necessarily fits in line from a schematic standpoint for what the Cardinals are looking to address and do differently in 2024. So you kind of know what you would get there. Zach Thompson, I think, does have that type of upside. You want to see it more consistently, and he has, of the 3, really been, and I'm including Dakota in this as well, Dakota, Liberatore, and Zach Thompson, which I realize Libby's on the IL right now. But of those 3 sort of candidates that were being bestowed a starting spot to just kind of see what they do with the runway the rest of 2023, Thompson has really been the most consistent. You want to see him be a little bit more efficient to take advantage of staying in those games longer, getting deeper into games, and the strikeout stuff that he has showed has been pretty good. So maybe you give him a little bit of credence. And even if Liberatore were to return healthy and flash the Tampa Bay upside, I'm talking about the 8 scoreless innings that he had against the Rays. If he could do that consistently, then he would get some credence as well. But he just has been the least consistent of the group. You see one flash of brilliance and then multiple duds in a row. Maybe injury was related to that. He said it was lifting weights that tweaked the back, so not really reading into, because I asked Ollie Marmol about that. I said, how did he get hurt, actually? Because the velocity obviously was, I didn't even have to say it. And he said, from what I understand, it happened in between the 2 starts or after his initial start there against Oakland. I think it was Oakland. And that's not the reason the velocity declined. You'd have to ask him, though. So reporters went and asked him, and he said it was a weightlifting thing, which I guess would have been like the next day after Libby had started. And then obviously they thought he would start Wednesday and didn't, so they put him on the injured list. We'll see when we see him again. But anyway, of the 3, like Zach Thompson's been the one that you would say, all right, if I had the most confidence in Thompson of that group going into the offseason, do I still want to give him the 5 spot in the rotation? The answer to me is no, not because of anything about Zach Thompson, but because of the fact that you're going to get one of those other starters injured in spring training, and then Zach Thompson, you're more comfortable sliding him into your 5 spot after you've already kind of suffered some attrition. If he's your number 6 going into camp and he stays that way by having a good camp, then he probably ends up on your opening day roster as your number 5 starter when somebody else gets hurt. That's sort of the mindset that I think the Cardinals need to have, and have Liberatore, have Hudson if he's still on the roster and in the organization, vying for that number 6 spot as well. Whoever earns that spot out of spring, that's your number 6 until he inevitably becomes your number 5. If I'm pessimistic about it and you don't really think that's reasonable, go back through time and you'll see that I'm 100% correct. A Cardinal starter gets injured in spring training every single year. So sorry to be the bearer of bad news on that. But my point with all of this is, well, the Cardinals are going to have their work cut out for them acquiring good pitchers. One probably will have to break that free agent record for a Cardinal of $87.5 million. Can they trade somebody or trade for somebody, I should say? Yeah, maybe, but you're talking about giving up a position player that you don't want to trade away. But maybe that's how they can get a number 1 and a number 2 in the same offseason without just blowing $150, $200 million on a pair of pitchers. And it's not that I don't think Cardinals fans would say, hey, no, do that. That sounds good to a lot of Cardinals fans. I just don't think realistically it's what the Cardinals have done historically. Then again, maybe that's what John Mozeliak means by we know we have to approach this differently. He's said that multiple times. So it is a little bit of a mystery to me what actually that is going to entail for the Cardinals, and it makes it kind of fun and exciting. But if you're a pessimist about it, you say, yeah, I'm not so fun and excited about it. I'm already seeing the writing on the wall of exactly what's going to happen, and then we're going to talk to John Mozeliak in January at Winter Warm-Up, and he's going to sell it on why it's actually really fun and great, and Cardinals fans are going to go, no, this is the same song and dance. Oh, boy, we're doomed. And the Cardinals fans might be right at this point, because last Winter Warm-Up, the whole deal was John Mozeliak saying, we didn't really delve into those starting pitching markets too heavily, and perhaps that ends up being a strategic mistake. Those are his words verbatim. And he said, hopefully our hope is that it's not considered a mistake and that we do have enough pitching. Clearly they didn't have enough pitching, and he's had to wear that. He's had to do the mea culpa, and he's done it to his credit. He said, we were wrong. We thought we had more pitching depth than we proved to have had, and we got it wrong. Granted, a lot of Cardinals fans kind of knew it in January, kind of knew it in December. Is what it is. You move on. But they know, I think, that they can't do it that way again and try and spin their way into depth and say, well, if you squint and you close your right eye completely and you spin around to make yourself a little bit dizzy, now suddenly you can say nice things about all these pitchers and why it's enough. The depth is enough. And I think as depth pieces, some of these pitchers are nice to have around. But if you're relying on them as your number 3, your number 4, and your number 5 starters, it gives a completely different look to a rotation. It's no longer a contending rotation. It's a rotation built on hope, love, and rainbows. I mean, that's what they had this year. And the problem was they spent money to do it. They were paying all 5 of the starters this year. I know Cardinals say spend up, or fans, I should say, spend up. That's kind of the rallying cry, and they're right, but it's always going to be spend up on the right guys because they were multi-million-dollar salaries for everybody in the rotation. Mikolas, Matz, Wainwright. Waino was making $17.5. And then even Jack Flaherty was, final year of ARB, Same thing for Montgomery, who had like a $10 million salary in the final year of ARB. So they were all getting paid, which is kind of why John Mozeliak probably felt he couldn't go to the free agent pitchers out there and offer a big contract, or even I think they probably weren't going to offer a big contract, but I bet they tried to do some medium-sized contracts, as Mozeliak, even though he said in January we didn't really delve into those markets, radio interviews and different interviews since then, he said, well, really nobody that we were after, either all those guys are hurt now, so it's a good thing we didn't get them, or they didn't really see an opportunity with the Cardinals. The opportunity that we were pitching to them didn't really make sense to them because they saw we were paying 5 starters. Which, yeah, exactly. Which is why I said all last offseason, you need to trade from your pitching depth and the starting rotation pieces that are on the 40-man roster. You need to move a couple of those guys out. But they didn't do that. So, it's not that the whole season wasn't relatively predictable. I wouldn't have predicted it to go this poorly, but you could at least understand where the trauma was going to come from, the trouble was going to come from. And it was from that pitching group, and Mozeliak, they thought they had it handled, and they did not. And I think they kind of used some wishful thinking to think it was handled, because to do anything else would have been very difficult. It would have been a complicated process, to use a former buzzword of the POBO. It would have been complicated to say, yeah, we've got these 5 guys we're paying, but I was advocating for it at the time. I said trade Jack Flaherty or Jordan Montgomery now in November or December in order to recoup a prospect or two. You don't have to trade him for anybody that's going to help your big league team, as long as you then turn around and sign a starter. But granted, the way it panned out, Montgomery and Flaherty were 2 of the good starters that they did have and were worth something to the deadline. So that wouldn't have been the complete easy answer, but they took out the ability to trade Mikolas when they decided to re-sign him, which was also kind of telegraphed. We figured that would be a very Cardinals type of move to make. But now we're wondering, with Mikolas just touching age 35 as of the 23rd of August, that was Wednesday, is he going to be the same guy in 2024? And if he is the same guy that he is right now, is that enough? Because he's 0-4 in August. He's got a 4.66 ERA for the season. Again, I think he's had some bad luck. Even tonight, some doubles that dink in at 69 miles per hour on the exit velocity end up killing you. But there were some hits that also the exit velocity was much higher. So it's not always something you can attribute to bad luck. But I think Miles Mikolas, man, at best, to answer the question that I posed at the top of this podcast, and I want to hear your guys' thoughts in the YouTube comment section as well. To me, he's your number 3 at best. And I only say that because I realistically just don't see a world in which the Cardinals go out and acquire 3 starters better that project to be better than Miles Mikolas. It's almost like I'm handicapping it, knowing that maybe I should be a little more, brimstone and fire when it comes to the Cardinals and having expectations and demands of what they should do. But realistically, they're paying Miles Mikolas, what is he making, like $18 million a year? They're just not going to be able to muster 3 guys that project to be better than that. They might sign somebody for 1 year, $8 million, and he ends up being a diamond in the rough and out pitching Mikolas. That's possible. But just your most median, reasonable expectation for what you're getting, they're not going to go in slotting Miles Mikolas as anything lower than the number 3. Is that enough in your mind for the Cardinals to have a contending rotation? I guess it depends on who they go out and get, and we're going to spend a lot of time in the offseason debating and discussing that very topic. But do you sign an Aaron Nola and one of the guys out of Japan? Do you spend like that? If you do, you go Nola, Shota Imanaga, who I think is generally considered the quote-unquote cheaper of the 2 big arms coming out of Japan this year. If Imanaga is your number 2, Mikolas is your 3, who's your 4? Is it a trade for Tyler Glasnow where maybe you only have to give up like, and here's the thing, I wouldn't do this trade, but just to give you an example, because I don't want to say Juan Yepes, and because everybody's going to go, deal, and then Rays fans are going to go, you're crazy, there's no way Tampa does that. And I'm not trying to get into one of those kind of things, but like if I said Alec Burleson for Tyler Glasnow, I don't think the Cardinals do that trade, just so we're clear. They seem to be very high on Alec Burleson. I'm not even saying the Cardinals should do that trade. Tyler Glasnow is very aptly named. Glasnow broken later. The guy does get injured a lot, and so it would be a gamble. But if you're gambling with some prospects or a couple of pieces that Tampa happens to like, And so they'll turn into perennial all-stars because Tampa never loses a trade. But from the Cardinals, maybe it's depth that you can afford to trade away. Do you have interest in a Glass now because he's upside as your number 4 in your rotation? Or maybe he would be the number 3, and that bumps Mikolas to 4 and defeats my entire premise. But those are the types of moves that need to happen if the Cardinals are going to have the contending rotation that they claim they think they can have. Because if they can't, I don't know what Nolan Arenado's doing here either. I've had Cardinals fans say, well, why does he demand a trade? I think it's because he's given the opportunity to the front office to fix it in the offseason because he believes, this is where he wanted to be. So, all right, we're going to chalk this up to one bad year, but you're going to fix it now, right? That means spending. That means making savvy trades. But if it doesn't look any different by June of next year, sayonara. Yeah, Arenado would demand a trade at that point, and I couldn't blame him. Goldschmidt would be out the door with him, pending what happens between now and February in terms of Goldie with an extension. I have no idea what that's going to look like. I have maintained Goldschmidt, should be a Cardinal for as long as he wants to be playing baseball because I believe that he will age gracefully. I understand that he's been kind of slumping here and there throughout the last 6 weeks or so, maybe even longer if people are looking up the Baseball Reference game log. But I still feel like Paul Goldschmidt's Paul Goldschmidt, and that's just one of the tenets to which I cling. And so if I'm wrong about that, I'm wrong about that. But that's sort of the way I view the world. But yeah, those guys don't want to be around for a multi-year rebuild. So if this thing doesn't get fixed in a jiffy in the offseason, yeah, there will be a lot of questions about the viability of the core that is in place for this team and whether or not the front office that is in place for this team can build around that core effectively in order to make sure they win enough games to make the playoffs and make runs toward the World Series before that core ages out. It's a lot, but it's kind of what the Cardinals have set themselves up to have to do this offseason because they've said we're going to contend in 2024. I think the lineup is there. I know that sounds crazy because they had the final 21 batters that came to the plate tonight were retired. They can't hit a lick right now. Ollie Marmol would say that they're so competitive and it's fine. I think Ollie Marmol's great. I know Cardinals fans don't, but you're seeing signs of a team that's just sort of laying down at times right now. And I know the Cardinals manager would disagree with me on that, but I would challenge his team to get a hit within 21 batters to finish the game if they're truly grinding the way that they would if it was 10 games above 500. You're fighting for a division championship. It's just a results-based business at a certain point. So you do want to see more of that to continue claiming that, yeah, this is a great offense. Don't worry, it'll all fall into place next year. I tend to think that it will, but I also think it's fair to demand or at least say, hey, let's see some signs of that the rest of the way more consistently in order to feel good about, kind of finding that rhythm going into the offseason. I still think that is important. So we'll kind of see the way that shapes up. But the pitching we know is going to be the biggest need and the biggest question at this point for the Cardinals. Where does Miles Mikolas fit in your mind to the 2024 rotation? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Where does he need to be? You can predict in the comments on YouTube where you think he's going to be, but then let me know where you think he needs to be slotted in order for the Cardinals rotation to be considered a genuine threat as a contender.